Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third installment of the Fed and Main Street webinar series. Today, we're going to be focusing on the immigrant experience during the pandemic, during COVID-19. My name is Adrian Franco. I'm Director of Community Development Finance at the New York Fed, and it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to host this event. I'm an immigrant myself, so this is a personal topic, and I'm very interested to hear from our panelists what they have to say in terms of the many challenges that immigrant communities are going through right now, but at the same time, some very important solutions and some very innovative ideas that we can use. We are convinced at the Fed that the only way that we'll have an equitable recovery is if everyone who lives in America is included in it, and that includes immigrants and their families. Some housekeeping events to start the event. This is open to the media. All remarks are on the record. Given the format of the forum, we won't be taking any questions from the participants, from the audience. The video of the entire webinar will be uploaded within a few days in the New York Fed website. And you will be able to go over it. If you have any questions after that, you can always reach out to our team as well. An important disclaimer, the opinions and views that will be presented today by our panelists do not necessarily reflect the views of the Federal Reserve or the New York Fed. Thank you again to all of you for joining us for this webinar. To start this important dialogue, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rosa. She is the President and CEO of Comunilife, as well as the Deputy Chair of the Board of Directors of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Thanks, Dr. Gill, for joining us. I'll hand it to you.
Good afternoon, and on behalf of the Board of Directors and Executive Team at the Federal Reserve Bank District 2, I want to welcome you all to the third session of the Fed and Main Street series, the immigrant experience during the COVID-19. The Fed and Main Street series at the New York Fed was developed so we could better understand the impact of the pandemic on our communities. This series brings together community development, nonprofit, business, and policy leaders to discuss the effects of the COVID-19 crisis on vulnerable populations and increase opportunity to work together for a more equitable economic recovery. Listening to communities has always played a critical role in the New York Fed's effort in fostering economic mobility, but it has never been more relevant than now. Among the communities that we need to hear from, perhaps with even greater sense of urgency, is the immigrant community. Immigrant workers make up a significant portion of essential workers, yet they have limited access to resources, including health care, housing, economic assistance, and business support that could help mitigate the increased health and financial risks of the pandemic. As policy discussions turn from crisis to recovery, what should be an effective, equitable recovery include? First, fair access to available resources. As you will hear today from some of our speakers, the immigrant communities still face significant obstacles to access resources and funds, consequently diminishing their opportunities for recovery. However, we will also hear today from some of the leaders paving the way for programs that narrow these disparities. Second, recovery efforts must also aim to build longer-term resiliency to reduce the immigrant communities' vulnerability to the health and economic shock and crisis brought by the pandemic, and limit the chances to amplify the effect of such crisis in the future. I wanted to thank every single distinguished speakers today for your time and your commitment to address some of these very critical issues. And I hope you find this discussion impactful in your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Gill, and thank you for all your support for the community development and outreach activities at the New York Fed. Next in the agenda, we have Bitta Mostofi. She is the Commissioner of the New York City Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, and we're looking forward to hear her opening remarks. Thank you, Bitta.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It is such an honor to join you. Thank you for the introduction and for the opening remarks from Dr. Gill, and to all the wonderful panelists, many of whom are our partners in the work that we do in my office. I'm very honored to join you today to kick off this third installment of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's Fed and Main Street series, and in particular on this critical and important conversation around the immigrant experience during COVID-19. My name is Bitta Mostofi. I'm the Commissioner for New York City's Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. And really the mission of our office is to promote immigrant inclusive policies and programs that advance the civic, economic, and social inclusion of immigrants in our communities. And when we talk about that and we talk about the significance of what that is, we're really talking about the well-being of New York City. We're a city and a home of over 8.6 million people that hail from all over the globe. In fact, 3.1 million are foreign-born New Yorkers. That's nearly 40% of our city's population. Immigrant New Yorkers speak over 200 different languages. They are over half of our small business owners, and they're an integral part of both our city's cultural life, but really our ability to thrive. New York City's immigrant populations make up 44% of our city's workforce. And in fact, at this moment in time, when we've been looking at who our essential workforce is, about 1 million New Yorkers comprise our essential workforce, and over half are in fact immigrants. 500,000 immigrant New Yorkers are undocumented, many of whom are employed at higher labor rates than native-born citizens or the foreign-born population as a whole. And over 1 million New Yorkers live in what we call mixed status households, meaning that somebody in their home is undocumented. And importantly, and a big part of the conversation that often gets left out is that immigrants have contributed over $232 billion to our city's GCP, and that is just remarkable. That's about 25% of our city's overall GCP. Prior to this pandemic, if we are honest, we know that there have been many injustices, inequalities, and disparities that have been prevalent across immigrant communities that have made many in our city more vulnerable to impact of such things like the COVID-19 pandemic. It is one of the reasons that in my office we have tried to center the importance of greater equity, greater justice, community empowerment, and the advocacy that we have done over the course of the last several years alongside many community partners, because we've recognized that we are not where we need to be as a city. Our immigrant workforce, and I think this is important for the purposes of today's conversations, are not just in one area or the other. They comprise our healthcare workforce, our education, our restaurant workforce, our construction workforce, really across the board in terms of what is so central and an important part of making New York City work and function. So I want to talk a little bit about what we've seen in terms of the disparate impacts across racial lines in the city. You know, we we know that the highest impacted or the greatest impacted communities due to the COVID-19 pandemic have been our lower income areas in our city, largely across the Bronx and Queens. We know that Black and brown New Yorkers lost life at twice the rate of white New Yorkers in our city. This is just devastating. It is a devastating but also honest reflection of just the tremendous amount of division and inequity that exists and continues to be perpetuated in our cities and communities, and where our work must start. My team has issued data and research that looks across many different social indicators and helping us to better understand, specifically amongst immigrant communities, where do the barriers continue to be pervasive, and where must we look at resolving or addressing some of these structural inequities that we see. First, I'll start with healthcare and health access. In New York, we see consistently still great disparities in access to health insurance coverage between citizen and non-citizen New Yorkers. Approximately 96% of U.S.-born New Yorkers are insured, compared to 79% of non-citizens. And that disparity gets even starker when we look at our undocumented populations, where only 55% have health insurance or coverage. We know as well that some of these health disparities are due to poor health care and pre-existing conditions that have not been adequately addressed and have led to some of these really stark, disparate impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the things that we've been doing as a city to address this is expanding our guaranteed health care for all program and initiative. And as the mayor announced earlier this week, we are expediting the rollout in Queens and Manhattan of the city's NYC Care program, which we launched last year and is available to all New Yorkers regardless of immigration status or ability to pay. And that's so essential because for too long, especially our undocumented communities, have been left out of any health care, any access to coverage in an effective and efficient way that guarantees primary care, that ensures that people don't have these underlying untreated conditions, and that helps to save lives both now and in a moment of crisis or pandemic. Additionally, about 22% of New York City's immigrants reside in what we call overcrowded households, meaning that more than one person lives in a room. And we can imagine and understand what that means when the guidance that's delivered or given to communities is to quarantine or to isolate, to not be near a family member, a friend, a household member who may be symptomatic or ill. And that presented great challenges for New Yorkers to be able to ensure that those who are, as I said, immigrants and living in these overcrowded households, that they could comply with the health guidance that was being given. In response to some of those efforts, we have elevated some of that reality, we've elevated temporary housing that's available to all New Yorkers who need it and whose doctors advise that in order to be able to isolate, in order to be able to quarantine, they really must be given a housing opportunity that is both free and that addresses the needs that they may have. And so temporary housing has been made available to those in need of support due to the overcrowded nature of their homes. Immigrant New Yorkers have higher rates of poverty, and this is despite the fact that they have higher labor participation rates, particularly amongst undocumented immigrants. And as a result of that, we see the increased concerns and urgency around hunger and food insecurity. And so to be responsive to those needs, the city has launched 3 initiatives, again, available to all New Yorkers regardless of immigration status, including the ability to pick up meals across our Department of Education sites, hundreds across the city for free, 3 meals a day, and an additional support of $25 million to the city's food bank partners and pantries that have been such critical locations, particularly for immigrant New Yorkers, to go and trust that they can receive the food that they need. And finally, on the food supports food delivery. You know, we know that there are so many New Yorkers, not just the elderly, but those with underlying conditions or who may not have a meal hub close enough to their home to access, that need delivery of food to their homes. And this is, again, free and available to all New Yorkers, regardless of immigration status. I also want to note that we are in a moment in time in which so many communities across our city, not just immigrant, have been deeply impacted by loss of employment, loss of income, or lack of or loss of jobs altogether. And unfortunately, what we've seen over and over again is a social safety net system and additionally a federal stimulus system that has left way too many New Yorkers out. The reality is, as I noted, 500,000 New Yorkers are undocumented. Over 1 million live in homes with at least one undocumented household member. And these families have been left out of federal stimulus and have little to no access to the public safety nets that are available to help people get through these difficult times and moments. This is an area of deep and ongoing concern and consideration. We are very proud to have partnered with the Open Society Foundation in receiving and helping to distribute a $20 million grant to support undocumented workers and their families at this time. But we know that that is not enough, and we continue to do the requisite advocacy and education with our partners in philanthropy and foundations at the city, the state, and the federal levels to really understand just how great this need is and how in order to recover, in order to help people get past this extremely challenging moment in time, we must double down and recognize that we have to support everyone and leave nobody behind. And finally, I'll end around in talking about what does recovery look like. And the reality is that much as you heard me articulate and talk, our research has shown us that we know many of these inequities exist. Our community partners do incredible work day in and day out to better serve our communities, to build trust with our communities, to ensure that nobody is left hungry, that nobody is left without the supports that they need, and everyone is valued for the contributions that they make to our city and to their families. And we cannot begin our recovery by starting in the center or by doing what we have always done. We must take a step back. We must look at our recovery and our interventions and the impacts that we will have at the communities and the individuals that have been most greatly impacted. We must have an honest conversation as our city, as our country hungers for at this moment and is frankly demanding about racial injustices and inequalities that remain pervasive. And in order to have a recovery that makes us more resilient, in order to have a recovery that reckons with and understands that we as a country, as a city, we cannot continue to operate with business as usual, that we must challenge ourselves to look at how we can change the way that we do business, how we can change the way that we prioritize and look at resources and needs in our communities so that the next time any of us are faced with a pandemic, there isn't a question about access to healthcare. There isn't a question around trust and knowing that there will be food, that there will be financial and other assistance made available to everyone, and that together that will make us stronger and more fortified to reach all of our fullest potentials, not just our newcomers, not just new New Yorkers, but the rest of us. And so I really thank, again, the Fed for engaging in this conversation. It is the right conversation to be had at this moment. I hope and know, given that I know many of the incredible panelists, that it will be one that sparks both ideas, but also all of us to action. And then I look forward to being a part of those next steps. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. Those numbers really remind us about, what the magnitude of the issues that we are facing. Next is our session 1 that we label the fight of immigrant communities. We're going to be listening to the challenges that these families are going through. Our first speaker is Manuel Castro. He was recently featured at the New York Times with his organization, New Immigrant Community Empowerment, because of the tremendous work that they are doing in Jackson Heights in Queens. Manny, a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Adrian. And I just want to say thank you to the Federal Reserve and to the team that brought this event together, and all the panelists and everyone that's going to share their experience today. Like the Commissioner said, it's a very important conversation to have, and we really commend the Federal Reserve for having it. As Adrian mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of New Immigrant Community Empowerment. We're also known as NICE by our acronym. We operate worker centers, 3 of them actually, in Jackson Heights, Queens, Mott Haven in the South Bronx, and in Flatbush, Brooklyn. But we're better known for our work in Central Queens, where we were founded and where we work with a large population of recently arrived immigrants, particularly day laborers who live and congregate in several neighborhoods in Central Queens. And so, as many of you know, we're actually near Elmhurst Hospital, one of the hardest hit hospitals by the pandemic. And so it impacted us very early on and very harshly. And so I have to say we're still dealing with the impacts. We're still supporting families who continue to get sick or continue to lose loved ones as a result of the pandemic. I'm actually heading to a funeral right after this conversation. And so it's important to note that the emergency is not over. We continue to live at the epicenter and experience the outcomes of them. However, I do have to say that our worker centers in Flatbush, Brooklyn, and in South Bronx are also at the epicenter if you look at the zip codes that continue to have incredibly high rates of infection and deaths in New York. I only have a few minutes, so I'll focus on a particular story of a member that we really care about, and it really touched us to have had a difficult experience through the pandemic, and also to answer some of the questions that we've been posed today to answer. And that is to sort of shed light on the lived experiences of essential workers, immigrant essential workers through the pandemic. So Susana, and I'm using a different name to protect her identity, responded to the crisis by immediately coming to our center and volunteering to help deliver food to those workers who were sick, who were losing their income. And this is very early on in the outbreak here in New York City. A construction worker herself, she had gone through health and safety training and had secured a job through our hiring hall. Unfortunately, a few weeks into the pandemic, she also lost her job and lost her income. And about a month in, she was really struggling. And as many of you know, newly arrived immigrants often send most of their money back home, often to children or older parents. So she had very little saved here to live on. So eventually, she was able to secure a job through an employment agency to clean the MTA subways as an essential worker. And this is not through the MTA, but through a subcontractor. And this subcontractor had recruited 12 other people from the same nationality, the same community. Generally, this is how employment agencies or labor brokers find low-wage workers. And immediately, she felt unsafe at the job. She was giving those clear surgical gloves, those gloves that, according to Susana, were better made to make sandwiches at home instead of the heavy yellow rubber gloves that she learned through the health and safety training she needed to have in order to work in such jobs. So it turns out that these gloves only lasted a few hours. They broke easily, but because of the intensity of the work and because she needed the money, she continued to work despite being exposed to the virus. It also took 3 days before she got a mask from her employer to protect herself, but she only got a disposable mask, which they were told, the workers, that they would need to keep for several days because the contractor didn't have access to more PPE equipment, personal protective equipment. But again, because of the demand of the cleaning job that she was in, the mask became wet and dirty very quick and essentially disintegrated within hours. So Susana had no choice but to make her own mask and go buy appropriate gloves to keep her job and stay on the job. On the first day, she also received cleaning rags, which the next day she was told that she would have to reuse. These were dirty rags that also seemed for her as a concern because she felt it was useless to continue cleaning subways with the same possibly infected rags. The detergents, the disinfectants, the chemicals they were using, eventually a few weeks in, were making workers lightheaded. The eyes were irritating, and so Susana decided to leave the job. Unfortunately, this is not anything different from what immigrant workers are experiencing in other industries, like in construction, like delivery work. Susana eventually was told that she would get paid $18 an hour when she should have been paid more because this is a contract with the MTA. She should have received prevailing wages. And she was not, the money she spent in PPE equipment was never replaced. So I'll leave it here because my time is up, but I hope that what I shared is helpful in continuing a conversation about how to better protect and support all communities regardless of immigration status. Unfortunately, employers who have lost a lot as well will look to cut corners and make up those losses. And unfortunately, they're putting workers at risk. This week is the first week construction workers are back to work. Many of our day labor members are reporting some of the same issues that Susana experienced. I'll leave it at that, and thank you so much for making this space and making it possible for me to share Susana's story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manny. A heartbreaking story, I'm sure that is shared by many in this community. Next, we have Dr. Gabriel Rincón, who is the chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Lutheran Family Health Centers. I must say that I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Rincón when he was a pioneer in educating the immigrant family on another pandemic, the AIDS pandemic. Many years ago was very important to provide education on this to the immigrant community. So I was always very impressed by his work, and now I'm very glad that he was able to join us to share his observations today. Dr. Rincón.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Federal Reserve Bank, to give the opportunity for this photo because it is really important. In this state of shock that we have since March 16, that outbreak the virus, to June 8, being testing and testing and testing, and I think it's the only way that we're going to finally get the vaccine or better meanings. I'm going to talk about only Brooklyn because that's where I have my private office, and also the hospital is in Brooklyn. So only in Brooklyn we lost more than 130 people, which is a lot. It's a devastating loss for all the families, all the people that live around, especially a very high number of immigrants. At this point, we are with the problem that the community, the immigrant especially, they don't know how to or what is the specific protocol to treat this pandemic. And they're afraid to go to the hospitals. They're afraid to buy different mask, gloves. But as the previous speakers mentioned, the main problem that they feel or they found is the lack of wages. So that's going to create a complete, let's say, disrupt completely the family because they support each other in the small room with too many people, get infected to everyone, but also they don't send the remittances or the money to Mexico, and that's going to create another worry for the families because they feel that if they have a problem over here, and even in Mexico is a little bit worse. Now we have the CDC and the WHO fighting, or no, I wouldn't say fighting in the strict way, but I would say they are with different opinion. And the opinion is that a person who's been infected can this person reinfect another person which has been sent, and CDC say yes. So you can get infected from somebody who has been infected. So those things are really important, but for the scientific community, but we have to transmit to the immigrant community because the immigrant community at this point is the phantom community because they do the works, all the essential works, the worst I would say, but and at the same time they are not recognized for that. There is a lack of financial aid, and that's going to create a big issue because if you file your income papers, your income taxes, you're going to have some reimbursed, you're going to have some financial aid or aid. But if you don't, you are exposed. You have no way, no means to bring food to right now at this moment, the visits to the hospitals, the visits to the clinics, the visits to different private office are in the low size. They don't even want to go. Persons in the immigrant community, they simply don't want to go because they are afraid. They are afraid and they say, instead of dying in New York or dying in the United States, I prefer go and die in my country. Whatever it is at the country. So it's creating, and we have a issue with mental health, and mental health is going to take very long period of time in order to treat the community. I would say it's going to. At this point, we have a big issue. Right now, it went over to the roof. We have the big issue with the community, which is trust. How can we regain the trust of the immigrant community? How can you overcome all those issues when you have 10, 15 people living in very short spaces? And sometimes when you realize or when you ask, they being infected, the majority of people with diabetes, people with heart disease, that's something that we have to take in consideration too. Even though New York is one of the friendliest states for the immigrant community, the rest of the country is not the same. The rest of the country has their own, they follow the different rules, and that creates this issue of trust. Trust, and we have to address mental health. Thank you so much. I know there is, we can stay the whole afternoon talking, and it's too much already, but for today, that's my contribution. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rincón, for your contribution, for your words. Next in the agenda, it's a pleasure for me to introduce Jennifer Son, who is the co-executive director of Asian Americans for Equality, as well as a member of the New York Fed Community Advisory Group. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Adrian. I'm really pleased to be able to join all of you this afternoon, and I'd also like to thank the Federal Reserve Bank for providing this platform to really increase the visibility of the experience of immigrants in New York City and the particular challenges that our communities are facing in trying to stay safely sheltered while also accessing federal and financial assistance more generally to help weather the storm during the pandemic. My perspective is informed by the work of AFI to economically empower low-income immigrant New Yorkers by providing safe, affordable housing for more than 1,500 residents, supporting immigrant small business owners and first-time homeowners through 2 CDFIs, and delivering language-accessible and culturally appropriate social services, including tenant organizing, health and entitlements benefits assistance, and workforce development. The impact of AFI's work is citywide and place-based, specifically in the immigrant neighborhoods of Chinatown on the Lower East Side, Jackson Heights, and Flushing. Before COVID-19, the Asian American community was experiencing a number of challenges already, having one of the highest poverty rates amongst all racial groups in New York City, with more than a quarter of Asian Americans living in poverty. Seniors also were experiencing a high rate of poverty, similarly of about 25%. Asian immigrant small businesses also were beginning to face a lot of displacement pressure with increasingly high commercial rent and more intense competition from online shopping. We know from our experience of doing small business lending and technical assistance to Asian and Latinx immigrant businesses that many of the immigrant small businesses in New York City operate on very thin margins and little to no cash reserves. Many of them open their businesses with limited income to adequately finance their startup and operating costs. Many of them also have poor credit and the lack of documentation because of operating cash businesses to support the loan underwriting that's necessary to be able to access more traditional forms of capital. For many Asian Americans, the current health crisis has unleashed a new boldness in how openly people are displaying harassment and discrimination against Asians. Asian Americans have been stabbed, beaten, bullied, spit on, pushed, harassed, and vilified based on the false assumption that they are to blame for the spread of the coronavirus. the New York City Commission of Human Rights reported receiving since February 1st over 350 complaints of discrimination spurred by fears over COVID-19. The majority of these complaints were made in March and April, and almost 40% of the complaints were specifically anti-Asian, compared to just 11 complaints of discrimination targeting Asians during the same period in 2019. The increase in bias incidents against Asians has had significant economic impacts on Asian small business owners, workers, and residents. It has been felt very deeply because of the concentration of immigrants who have invested in small businesses, especially those who are undocumented, because it is the only means of moving out of poverty. We know from the experience of our small business CDFI, Renaissance EDC, through their small business emergency loan funds, which was created immediately after the rise of anti-Asian discrimination in March, that Renaissance EDC has deployed about $1.2 million out of an emergency loan fund that was funded through private bank contributions and philanthropy. Renaissance EDC has also helped 70 small business owners access PPP loans as a CDFI, and we have seen directly the importance and the impact of CDFI intermediaries in really being able to leverage their relationships with immigrant small business owners and making sure that they can navigate a very complex application process to be able to access crucial financial assistance. Through this support, we've been able to reach approximately 90% of our borrowers. 90% of them are Asian, 4% of them are Latinx, 7% of them are white. And this is after targeting predominantly Asian immigrant neighborhoods, recognizing that they were experiencing acute discrimination and economic impact because of the coronavirus. 54% of those loans were made in Queens, 37% of them to Manhattan, and then 9% to Brooklyn businesses. And so you can see that the geographic concentration of small businesses is fairly high, not surprisingly, in the borough of Queens. We also know that workers have been really severely impacted by the coronavirus and also by the anti-Asian discrimination, in that because a lot of the workers are afraid of taking mass transit, because they have directly experienced verbal or physical harassment while taking public transit, while walking to and from subway stations, there is a real fear of Asian workers to either stay in their jobs or to return to work if they have jobs to go back to. Many of these workers are older workers. We know that in Flushing, for example, that the majority of workers, 55% of them, are aged 30 to 54 years old. So they're particularly vulnerable, harder to employ, and have also language access barriers that really limit their opportunities and further concentrate them in low-wage jobs with limited to no benefits. 20% of them, for example, work in healthcare and social assistance. 15% of workers, Asian workers, work in retail, and about 11% of them work in accommodation and hospitality and food services. These are the very industries that have been severely impacted and particularly hard hit by the virus. And so we've seen a huge spike in unemployment insurance claims by Asians in a way that we have not seen for decades. We know also that Asian women have been more impacted than Asian men because of their concentration in occupations like home health care, child care, that make them particularly vulnerable. AFI has received over 1,500 calls since April from Asian community members seeking help with applying for unemployment insurance. But we found that the majority of them are not even eligible because of their undocumented status. And this includes both Asian immigrant workers as well as small business workers. I'll also end by talking about the impact on housing. We have heard from our work in organizing tenants that a lot of Asian residents are also experiencing discrimination, and particularly for housing discrimination. where many community members have come to AFI asking for help because they are facing illegal harassment and pressure as well as eviction because either a family member has tested for COVID or there's just been a fear from their neighbors or their landlords that they might have the virus. And so they've been pressured to move out. This has contributed directly to a disturbing increase in Asian street homelessness that we've seen in Chinatown and in Flushing. And so we believe it's really important for all levels of government to really focus on investing in affordable housing acquisition, preservation, and development. That work is more important than ever, as well as continuing to find ways to provide income support for immigrant small business owners and workers, regardless of immigration status. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And we are going to move to our next speaker, José Luis Cruz, who is the Executive Vice Chancellor and University Provost of the City University of New York and a great friend of the New York Fed. José Luis.
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you to the Fed for giving us this opportunity. Struck me as I've been hearing the other panelists speak that the information I have to share with you from the City University of New York demonstrates that we are in fact a microcosm of the city. We are the University of Immigrants. Close to 40% of our students, and we have 275,000 across the 5 boroughs in undergraduate and graduate programs, and another 250,000 of them that are in adult continuing education programs. About 40% of them were born outside of the U.S. mainland. 45% speak a native language other than English at home. In total, our students claim 205 countries of origin and speak 186 languages. And we have thousands of undocumented students who work day in and day out to meet their full potential. As we have been thinking about the effect of COVID-19 on our student body, on our immigrant students during the past several months, we've been struck with some of the things that have already been shared, which is the disproportionate way in which they have been affected. 1, because of where they live. 2, with who they live. 3, the density of that living situation. 4, their lack of access to adequate health care. 5, the fact that they happen to be essential in every sense of the word and are actually out in the front lines trying to keep the rest of us safe. And also we've noticed that there's very specific patterns as to which of our immigrant students and where they live are showing the highest levels of impact. And so we're looking at ways in which we can, working with the city and our CBO partners, be a better service to them. For example, West Indians in Crown Heights and Flatbush in Brooklyn, South Asians in Jackson Heights in Queens, Ecuadorians in High Bridge and Morris Heights in the Bronx. And of course, our many undocumented students who are working in the front lines, as I said earlier. So how we go about addressing the needs of this most important population of City University of New York students is one of the issues that's top of mind, particularly not solely because of the role the pandemic has played in disrupting their lives, but also the toxic national climate around immigration in general and what that does to people's emotional and mental well-being. So in the interest of time, I'll just share 3 things that we've been working on at the City University. First of all, we're trying to make up for the deficiencies of the way in which federal monies have been allocated and left out many of the immigrant communities we serve. And so through the establishment of the Chancellor's Emergency Fund, today we have been able to provide much needed aid to over 2,000 undocumented students through by means of philanthropic dollars that we have been able to raise. And so as we come to new sources of funding, we are making sure that we develop equitable ways of allocating them. And if there are certain students that are left out of, say, federal funding programs, that those be taken care of through other means. Second, our long-standing community citizenship now effort continues to provide immigration law service, free immigration law service programs for our students and their families, provide free and confidential services, and is now working to double down on the work that's needed in preparation for whatever the decision may come from the Supreme Court later this month regarding the DACA program in particular. And finally, I will say that we are looking to continue to target our resources as we look at the fall semester in particular to ensure that we bridge any problems with the digital divide as folks try to access online courses and continue to progress towards their degree. The last thing I'll say, because I think it's just so emblematic of how we look for immigrants, not only to serve as essential workers and pillars of our communities and drive this city forward, is how they ultimately end up being the ones that help us get to hopefully a better place as a society. I mentioned earlier that the Supreme Court will soon be making an announcement or a final decision on the DACA program. And it's interesting to note that among the plaintiffs, there are 5 co-plaintiffs that are connected to CUNY. And so their life stories and their experiences are very much going to be weighing on the minds of our Supreme Court justices as they make their decisions. And finally, I will say that our situation would be, from the standpoint of our ability as a university to serve our students, much worse if it weren't for the leadership of Governor Cuomo and the state legislature when they recently passed the New York State José Peralta DREAM Act, enabling undocumented students to qualify for financial aid. So with that, I'll end my comments. Just so proud that our university serves this important immigrant community we're discussing about today, and very much look forward to continuing to work with those that are represented in this important event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, José Luis. In the interest of time, I'm just going to say thank you to all the speakers so far. I'm going to hand the role of moderator to my colleague, Chelsea Cruz, Associate Director of Community Development Finance. Thank you all.
Good afternoon. My name is Chelsea Amelia Cruz, Associate Director of the Community Development Finance team at the New York Fed. It's my pleasure to introduce our next session, Path to Equity, Innovative Solutions to Assist Immigrants. During this session, we will hear about efforts in the fields of financial inclusion, entrepreneurship, housing, and health sectors to tailor solutions to address financial and economic disparities experienced by immigrant populations. I'd just like to make one change to the order of our speakers. We're going to begin this session first with Nathalie Molina Nino, and then we'll move to Kathy Mahan. So to begin, it's my pleasure to introduce Nathalie Molina Nino, who's the CEO of O to the Third Power, which appropriately stands for Outcomes Over Optics. Nathalie is also an investor and author, and she will discuss entrepreneurship and support for immigrant-owned businesses. Nathalie, thank you so much. Over to you.
Can you hear me?
There we go. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for that kind introduction and for your flexibility today with the schedule as well. My distinguished fellow panelists will be talking about such important topics that are really near and dear to my heart, from credit unions to housing and healthcare. And I want to open by saying that oftentimes business ownership is relegated to almost this idea of the higher levels in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? It's something that I think we sometimes think comes after an individual's basic needs are met. We've got to make sure that people first have a roof over their heads, that they have food to eat. Healthcare, of course, comes amidst all of that. And then after all of that, we think about how we as a society can move people into the economic class that can own a home, maybe have a savings account, start a little business, and maybe create jobs for others, and someday perhaps even 1-2 generations later, set their sights on this idea of a growing business, maybe even a business with a global footprint. And that's very much the sort of linear, incremental, maybe even traditional version of economic mobility and progress. But thankfully, in my experience, and it sounds like the experience of many of those at the event today, immigrants don't care about linear progress or incrementalism. I wrote a book titled Leapfrog, and in the book I talk about remembering seeing farmers in the Ecuadorian Andes, where half of my family is from, who had never had a landline in their homes, but now they're suddenly walking around with 2 smartphones in their pockets. That is the definition of a leapfrog, and it's what we aspire to in the world of tech. And when immigrants come here, that aspiration to leapfrog, it doesn't change, and it certainly doesn't go away. In fact, there's a study by the National Foundation for American Policy that came out last year that found that immigrants have founded 55% of the billion-dollar startups in the United States. So immigrants, it would appear, disagree with Maslow, and they think that business ownership really, in the context where they can control their own destinies, is about as important as the air that we breathe and the food that we eat, which really makes sense, especially if you come from places where the infrastructure and the national safety nets have been breached or they just can't be trusted, which, I'll be honest, is what makes 2020 so incredibly devastating. Because when over 90% of Black and Latinx small business owners were excluded by design from hundreds of billions of dollars in federal stimulus, it's nothing short of devastating to think how many immigrants are impacted. Immigrants in my community, the Latinx community, have become the fastest growing small business owners across the United States. According to, in fact, a recent study by Stanford, over the past 10 years, the number of Latinx business owners grew 34%, compared to 1% for all business owners broadly. But it's not just the Latinx community. In the last month, as my team and I scrambled to push through hundreds of federal PPP loans, frankly cashing in on every favor from every bank executive that I have ever met in my entire life, I met an immigrant from Sierra Leone, and her name is Mariama. And Mariama, she survived a civil war before coming to the United States, and then becoming a nurse practitioner and ultimately co-founding her healthcare business, Suma Home Care, which is located just outside of Philly. Mariama is the quintessential leapfrogger. And thanks to our federal government stimulus failure, which is the only thing that I can think of calling it, Mariama's business, with 150 employees that provides critical medical services to her predominantly Black community, was nearly lost. As Mariama recently told Poppy Harlow in a CNN interview, TD Bank inexplicably rejected her PPP loan, and in desperation, she went looking for alternatives. And when she finally found my team and I, we were able to connect her to Live Oak Bank out of DC, who ultimately secured a loan. That means Mariama, her employees, and the patients that they care for will get a fighting chance of survival. Not a guarantee, but a chance. You see, Mariama is a perfect example because it shows that the immigrant experience doesn't finish with an entrepreneurial happy ending. It actually starts with entrepreneurship. It grows with entrepreneurship. And yes, sometimes it ends with a wonderful story of entrepreneurial success. And I'm one of those. I'm here because my scrappy entrepreneurial dad worked tirelessly in the sweatshops of Los Angeles, so I could go to a fancy prep school in Hollywood Hills and ultimately even fancier colleges. And I'm here because my mom took a union job so that no matter what my dad was up to, we always had health insurance and basic protection, which is why really my ask and my contribution today is for all of us, whether we are investing from our piggy banks or we are professional investors or people with influences into everything from pension plans to endowments. I would ask us to invest in anything and everything that protects and helps small businesses survive and thrive. And I would also say that despite the popularity of TV shows like Shark Tank and the apparent ubiquity of venture capital, let me remind you that venture capital touches 0.05% of all businesses in this country. 0.05%. I love repeating that number because nobody ever believes me. Venture capital takes up 99% of the oxygen and seemingly 99% of the press, but what most businesses really need is good loans, lines of credit, even equity crowdfunding and other forms of innovative financing. So I would say, let's turn off the TV. Shark Tank is fun, but it's a TV show. Let's stop letting the venture capitalists take all the oxygen and focus our efforts on the businesses that matter most. Because I cannot think of anything more important than the small and growing Main Street businesses of our nation's immigrants. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and thank you for that call to action. Before we move to our next speaker, I'd just like to announce that everyone that as we're running a bit over time, we will be extending this call to 3:30 p.m. So this call will go until 3:30 p.m. Next, we have Kathy Mahan, President and CEO of Inclusive, a longtime partner of the New York Fed, and she'll be discussing financial inclusion and the critical role of credit unions. Kathy, over to you.
Thank you, Chelsea, and thank you so much for allowing us to participate today. We're very excited to be part of this forum, and just listening to the speakers in front of me, and I know that the ones yet to come, I know I'm certainly learning a lot, and I appreciate being included in this. My name is Kathy Mann, and I'm the CEO of Inclusive. Inclusive is a national network of community development credit unions, also known as CDFI credit unions. At Inclusive, we dedicate ourselves to closing the gaps and removing barriers and financial opportunities for distressed and underserved communities by providing capital, making connections and building capacity, developing and scaling innovative products and services, all designed to transform local progress into lasting change at the national level. Community development credit unions deliver safe, affordable, responsible financial products and services in underserved and often overlooked neighborhoods and communities, and specifically are extremely active in immigrant communities around the country. Many families reside and work. Organized by, for, and of the people and communities they serve, they develop the financial products that meet the needs of their communities, from the smallest of flexible loans to meet emergencies and keep people out of the predatory payday lender lines, all the way up to small business financing and home mortgage loans that help members build assets and wealth. The Inclusive Network serves 11 million residents of low-income, urban, rural, and reservation-based communities across 46 states, D.C., and Puerto Rico, and hold over $121 billion in community-owned and controlled assets. I say that because I think a lot of times people think of the CDFI sector overall as sort of an interesting experiment that someday needs to scale. And I'm here to say that our institutions, both in the community development credit union sector as well as across the CDFI field, we are developing solutions that are scaling. And I think we provide a lot of opportunity and vision for the future. At Inclusive, we also manage a network of over 100 credit unions in our Juntos Avanzamos initiative. These institutions are committed to serving and empowering immigrants in their community, and specifically in the Latino community. Inclusive Juntos Avanzamos credit unions do make a pledge to make sure that they will not only commit themselves to serve the community and serve immigrant communities, but to serve everyone in the communities that they're working in. And so that means they are committed to accepting alternative forms of ID for account opening purposes, and that includes matrícula consular, that includes foreign passports, and of course municipal IDs. They also have flexible loan underwriting criteria and use alternative forms of establishing creditworthiness, which is particularly important to make it possible for immigrants without traditional credit histories to access credit from responsible financial institutions that will offer the types of affordable, transparent, and relevant products that they need, both for their households, for their businesses, and to be able to purchase homes. Inclusive and the Junta Sabanzano's credit unions offer also emergency loans for heightened holders, or those folks with using taxpayer ID numbers instead of Social Security numbers. And they have long created targeted loan programs for citizenship and legalization processes, as well as wealth building lending, such as originating heightened mortgages, which can be challenging because they're not able to be sold in the secondary market. They're held in portfolio, and those end up being some of the most important, valuable, and frankly, low-risk loans that can be made because they're such well-performing assets for credit unions and for communities. The pandemic and the response has seen tremendous challenges, and our members have shared innumerable stories of struggle and resilience. Community development credit unions have been providing relief to heavily impacted individuals and families in numerous ways, including offering low interest or 0% emergency relief loans to individuals and families and households just to make basic ends meet, loan payment forbearance to ensure that nobody is having to preference making a loan payment over meeting essential needs in their households during this time, increasing credit limits, enabling people to be able to access greater lines of credit so that they can have capital, whether for the individual, for business, or for the home at these times, waiving fees, and most importantly, expanding financial counseling initiatives and expanding the range of financial counseling to also incorporate the whole range of access points for other supportive services to help folks access a range of social service needs, and ensuring that people who come to the credit union are going to be able to get connected with a whole range of community partners and organizations to be able to help them get through these times. About 40% of our members became PPP lenders at the beginning of the Paycheck Protection Program, that was initiated through the SBA and Treasury. We had less than 20% of credit unions were approved SBA lenders, and now we have more than 40%, and I think most recent numbers is upward of more than half of our members that were able to be originating Paycheck Protection Program loans to small businesses in their communities. We've been able to originate more than $620 million in lending, and this is in forgivable loans, made to small and very small businesses in low-income communities and businesses and entrepreneurs of color. CDCUs, the credit unions that engaged in the PPP lending, faced tremendous obstacles. They were working overnight, sometimes over weeks, trying to do everything they can, and at all hours of the day and night, trying to process applications on the platform. As many of you know or may know, that in round one, they were competing directly with some of the biggest lenders who were doing automated submissions. And many of our members talked about getting bumped off the platforms or how it took several hours just to get every single business loan through. So it could take up to several hours just for a single business loan to make its way through the platform. After we and our partners in Congress and across the CDFI field successfully advocated with the SBA and within the administration, those robo-submissions were suspended, and that submission time dropped to just a few minutes per loan. So we were able to overnight, by the end of round one and beginning into round two, we're able to incredibly grow the ability of our lenders to be able to get loans through the platform. And what that really means is capital out in immigrant communities and other communities of color around the country. Our network members adopted new systems to enhance their online and mobile banking capabilities, including things like streamlined remote account opening, which was particularly important when serving an immigrant population and when we're accepting alternative forms of ID or trying to enable folks to open accounts if they have limited credit histories. We had to implement a lot of different patchwork systems to be able to make sure we were able to be compliant in following Know Your Customer requirements, but also being able to ensure that everybody who wanted to open an account to either be able to access a stimulus payment or receive payment from their workplace remotely, that they were no longer able to access to get cash or checks in hand, that they were going to be able now to do that by remotely opening an account with the credit union with all kinds of IDs and being able to be as flexible as possible. We also increased our capabilities around remote deposit capture and online lending. So being able to now originate loans remotely, which enabled folks to be able to access capital without having to come in to an institution and perhaps risk the safety, their own safety or that of members of their household. We also have leveraged the financial coaching tools. We run a program called Pathways to Financial Empowerment, and we were able to expand it and streamline it so that loan officers or member service representatives within the community development credit unions could have a wide range of different tools they could connect their members to, but in a very streamlined way and in bite-sized, bite-sized packages. So depending upon what the presenting needs were of the individual or household that they were speaking with, they would be able to either plug them into direct services that the credit union could provide in terms of maybe a relief loan or getting them access to an account, or if it was something beyond the ability of the credit union to perform, they could have right at their fingertips the ability to connect them to social service providers in their communities. So that was a really critical enhancement, and it was quickly moving that the network was able to spring into action to get a whole range of sort of supplements to the type of counseling they had historically done. I'm just going to share, because there's so many different ways I could talk about some of the ways in which we've been designing products and services, but I want to share a couple of examples. Just right here in New York, we have Brooklyn Cooperative Federal Credit Union. They originated, they're a $20 million community development credit union based in Bushwick and Bedford-Stuyvesant. They originated more than $6 million in paycheck protection loans, getting vital capital out to minority and immigrant small and micro businesses throughout Brooklyn. Neighborhood Trust Federal Credit Union, Washington Heights, equally a small institution that was able to reach a wide range of businesses in their communities and successfully advocated for a lot of changes in the PPP program that has made it easier for sole proprietorships to be able to document kind of how they could qualify and seek and obtain the loan forgiveness. So they've been at the forefront of not just helping their businesses in their community be able to access these programs, but also working with us to advocate for changes to the program that would ensure that businesses of all types would be able to access this vital capital at this time. Stepping Stones Federal Credit Union, which is a very small credit union in Wilmington, Delaware. It's under $5 million in total assets. They originated more than $1 million in paycheck protection loans and provided a huge resource for small businesses, minority businesses in their communities. Lower East Side People's Federal Credit Union, also here in New York, another PPP lender, but has also developed, along with Inclusive and with support from Citibank, a loan payment forgiveness program that expands beyond the confines of the PPP program and is providing sort of forgivable loans to small businesses that weren't qualifying under PPP, and that was specifically significant for immigrant businesses and for ITIN holders. Point West Credit Union out in Portland, Oregon, teamed up with the Northwest Credit Union Foundation, Trailhead Credit Union, and Consolidated Community Credit Union to offer 0% emergency loans to low-income members affected by the pandemic, and they specifically have been targeting the undocumented immigrant community to make sure that folks who might not be able to access other forms of stimulus or relief know that they can be served and will be well served by their local credit unions. Those are just a few examples. There's just so many across our more than 300 network partners. And Inclusive specifically, we're committed to raising and channeling capital to make these locally driven efforts grow and thrive. Next week, we're going to announce the launch of the COVID-19 Resiliency Fund to build the capital reserves and continue to fuel the growth in minority-designated credit unions and CDFI credit unions in developing and scaling these types of innovative products and services, not just in response to the COVID pandemic, but in response to all of the recognition of all of the challenges and all of the discrimination that has been plaguing our communities for decades and for generations. We really are going to have the Resilience Fund be targeting a whole wide range of responses that ensures that this become the moment that we turn the tide and make sure that capital is flowing to those initiatives that are doing the most and getting the deepest into the communities that they're intended to get to. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for those remarks. I'm going to move right along to Jessica Katz, the Executive Director, Citizen Housing and Planning Council, who will speak about solutions in housing and zoning. And with apologies, I realize we're over time. Just a reminder to our speakers to please try and keep your remarks to 5 minutes. I know there's so much that we can say and there's so much that needs to be said, but appreciate that. So over to Jessica. Thank you.
Thanks, Chelsea. So hello, everyone. Thank you to the New York Fed for inviting me to be here today. My name is Jessica Katz. I'm the Executive Director of the Citizens Housing and Planning Council, CHPC. We're a think tank here in New York City. I'm here today as a housing policy expert, not an immigration expert, although my own immigration story from the Soviet Union in the late 70s certainly informs my passion about today's topic. CHPC is working on a variety of New York City housing topics that affect the lives of immigrant New Yorkers every day, including housing policies to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, equitable code enforcement, and regulatory reform to make basement apartment conversions safer. Our effort to reimagine what the city's next housing plan should look like posits that the current focus on just counting the number of units, the number of deals that we close, misses an opportunity to think about what housing problems we are trying to solve and for whom. So in the time we have leading up to the city's next housing plan, we're looking at housing policy through a variety of new lenses to help us clarify the goals of our housing plan. So for example, what does a housing plan for racial equity look like? What does a feminist housing plan look like? What about a housing plan whose sole goal is to improve the health of New Yorkers? So today, I want to talk about how to craft a housing plan that would align New York City's housing policy with our past, present, and future as a city of immigrants. CHPC published an issue brief that describes the housing challenges and disparities faced by New York's immigrant communities. New York City's immigrants are more likely to be poor, more likely to be rent-burdened. Undocumented immigrants are much more likely to live in overcrowded housing and many other obstacles. Yet for all these challenges, it's these same newcomers from across the globe that have led the city's growth and prosperity throughout history. So it's incumbent upon us to craft a housing policy that promotes the stability and success of New York City's immigrant population. So here's just a brief snapshot from our forthcoming housing plan for an immigrant city to be published later this year. First, enhance language access and anti-discrimination policies for housing programs. Second, enhance data collection that allows us to learn more about the needs of immigrant communities. If we don't have the data, communities and their needs become invisible to policymakers. Third, enable basement apartment conversions. The mayor's office recently zeroed out the budget for the city's pilot program for basement apartment conversions in East New York. This program had been the centerpiece of the mayor's marquee East New York rezoning, and just a few months ago, it was a key pillar in his State of the City address. So why eliminate such an important yet small and inexpensive program? Well, in a backwards way, it actually makes complete sense. If the goal of your housing plan is to create 300,000 units, then it's no wonder that a pilot program to spend $12 million converting 40 basement apartments in East New York gets the axe. But if your goal is to explore new ways to make life easier for New York City's immigrant communities, especially in the neighborhoods hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, This is exactly the kind of program you'd want to preserve. So you can see how important it is that the next housing plan defines its goals well and goes beyond just a unit count. Number 4 is equitable code enforcement. Most housing plans in modern New York City history don't mention code enforcement very much, except to say there should be more of it. But many of the folks on this panel know well all the ways that 311 can sometimes be weaponized against immigrant communities. So we really need that code enforcement strategy to be an equitable one. Number 5 is inclusive zoning. So zoning is another one of those housing policy tools that can seem dry, technocratic, bureaucratic, but it can be used intentionally or unintentionally to exclude some people and protect the needs of others. Finally, we need housing development that serves the needs of intergenerational families. Our housing design, our zoning, all of our regulatory frameworks are designed with a nuclear family in mind. But our households are so much more diverse than our housing stock is. One of CHPC's marquee projects is our Making Room initiative, which seeks to create flexibility and responsiveness in our housing design and regulations that reflects the way we really live today. So these are just some of the housing policies that we could harness to help immigrant communities thrive in New York City and make sure New York continues its role as a magnet for newcomers. Stay tuned for more on this critical subject as our housing plan for an immigrant city continues. And thank you so much for inviting me here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to move to our last speaker for this session, Judith Flores. Judith holds many titles, but she is the Associate Professor at NYU School of Medicine, and she's the immediate past chair of the Board of Directors for the National Hispanic Medical Association, and she will, of course, be discussing solutions in healthcare. Judith, over to you.
Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone. I know we have limited time, but I did want to say a little bit about what my function is here today. I'm actually a New York City physician. I work for Health and Hospitals Corporation, and I'm delighted to be part of what is going on in New York and how we responded to this crisis. We moved rapidly, and I must say in many cases, we were able to recover quite a bit. We saw a lot going on in this hospital and all our municipal hospitals in New York, but the strength does show, and I'm extremely happy to be working on recovery. At NHMA, National Hispanic Medical Association, we are a national association of physicians that are dedicated to the care and advocacy of Hispanics, immigrants, and other underrepresented populations. My function there is really to look at the U.S. with other physicians. So I've learned tremendously from them as to what they do and what they have available in their communities and how they're able to address the immigrant situation throughout the country. In the U.S., the data is less than half of the states, since we depend a lot on data, less than half of the states report COVID data by ethnicity or any other health data for that matter. Undercounting, however, still reflects a disproportionate impact on racial and ethnic populations. Today, CNN reported that there are more than 2 million confirmed cases of COVID in the United States, but 113,000 deaths. Less than half the states report COVID and any other health data by ethnicity. They certainly do not and underreport immigrants from any country because they are not going to be participating in a lot of this information gathering. Hispanics make up over 18% of the U.S. population. They represent nearly 30% of the total U.S. COVID cases. Included in there are mostly the undocumented Hispanics and the documented Hispanic. The death rates in locations with high immigrant Hispanic populations, and there it is neutral for country of origin, are nearly 30%. 28% of the population in New York City is Hispanic. Testing is blinded to the status and free, unlike many other states. 40% of those tested in New York tested positive were Hispanic. This June, many of the states with high immigrant populations reopened with limited access to testing and tracking. These states are showing significant increases in positive cases, hospitalization, utilization, and mortality.
Arizona, for example, and I know we're kind of veering away from New York, but I think that this can teach us how to respond to our future surge and how important it is to continue to do what we are doing well and improve on it. Arizona, for example, has about 29,800 confirmed cases of COVID with 519 deaths, and they are all at capacity for the hospital utilization to date. 30% of the state's population are Hispanic immigrants, mostly living in Maricopa County. They make up over half of the cases and fatalities due to COVID. These are mostly undocumented immigrants from mostly Central and Mexico, the Mexico region. This disproportionate impact is repeated in many other states and reflects the system of limitation, the systemic limitation of data used to make healthcare policy decisions in the U.S. today. One of the recommendations is that we have a mandatory racial ethnic data bill for infectious disease reporting. This has been proposed as part of the CARE Act. If passed, this will prove to be an essential tool for understanding the impact of COVID on communities of color and immigrants. It will help control the pandemic by focusing resources. COVID-19 has exacerbated barriers to health care for many populations, in particular immigrants, and has magnified the inequities of our healthcare system. Factors promoting inequities, and some have already been mentioned in these vulnerable populations, are employment, of course. Many of us are essential workers with high-risk exposure. They work in service industries, and I think someone mentioned a poignant story of one particular employee who really did not get, because there was no regulation, got limited access to information or infection control or personal protective equipment. Another barrier is the socioeconomic inequity, unpaid leave, job and food insecurity, and ineligibility for the stimulus payment. Many of you have discussed this, and I've learned quite a bit today about that. Health vulnerability, which is something I work with every day, that loss or lack of health coverage. Hispanics are about 3 times more likely than whites to be uninsured. They are about 50% more likely to die of diabetes than whites are. Other immigrant populations are similarly affected, especially from the Caribbean countries. We have a very high rate of hypertension among them. This rate is much higher, particularly in mixed status and immigrant families. They are not likely to have a PCP or their own provider or any continuity of care that's needed to help manage chronic disease. And of course, documentation status. In many states, there are people with documentation status, mixed status, or undocumented are not eligible for any testing or care. Fear, we mentioned fear before. Mixed status, undocumented, and even documented immigrants fear the public charge. They might be on the road to obtaining their citizenship, and they certainly don't want to jeopardize this through the public charge and through gaining access for services from a public health system. So promoting health equity for immigrants promotes the public health for all of us. One of the recommendations that I'd like to focus on is the National Immigration Law Center identified a successful response to the COVID-19 is to have a contingency on the ability of every community member to access needed care and resources without fear of adverse immigration consequences on themselves or their loved ones. Congress has passed a relief bill that excluded many immigrants from eligibility for Medicaid testing and or treatment, and left millions of immigrants tax filing families out of a proposed tax rebate. There is a clear need for public health policies that are coordinated and inclusive regardless of status or region. Enacting federal relief programs, especially in a pandemic, need to ensure financial and health support that is broadly available in order to reduce many of the inequities facing immigrants and other underserved populations. The virus does not discriminate, and containing it helps us all. Testing, tracking, and treatment has been successful in New York City and in New York State and other similar states, and is the most successful intervention globally for containing spread and not overwhelming limited medical resources. Universal testing is not available. It has been slow in implementation, costly, and not targeted to the most affected immigrant and vulnerable populations, both nationally and on state level. Consideration also should include addressing financial barriers to the implementation of recommended public health interventions, addressing some of the food insecurities which have been mentioned here today by initiating a disaster SNAP program for emergency distribution. This does not occur nationally. To develop another opportunity is to develop alternatives to unemployment insurance for people currently excluded, specifically when they are undocumented. To expand safety and economic protections during a pandemic, regardless of immigration status, is important to all of us and to our public health. And finally, to enact the Pandemic Occupational Health and Safety Law to mandate compliance with OSHA and CDC standards to reduce the spread of COVID-19. I hope that we can all learn from this experience and be able to move as a country. Learn from the states that have been having some progress and move the others along, because many of our patients are left behind without these services. Thank you so much for inviting me to this.
Thank you so much, Judith. And thank you to all our amazing speakers from sessions 2 and from sessions 1. Obviously, there's a lot of passion and there's a lot to say about this topic. And in the spirit of that, we obviously are going to move past 3:30, but there won't be a hard stop to this call. We want to give the appropriate time to our next amazing speaker. So it's my honor to introduce our last session, the impact on immigrants' home country. This session will focus on the pandemic's effects on immigrant families, financial well-being, and its impact on remittances across borders. We're honored to have the participation of Jorge Isla Lopez, Consul General of Mexico in New York, who will discuss this topic with Michael Shetzko, our Senior Vice President, International Affairs and Strategy at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Michael, over to you.
Thanks, Chelsea. And in the interest of time, I think we'll just jump right into it. First of all, welcome, Consul General. We're very happy to have you here. I think it would be good to maybe first start out by level setting. Maybe it would be good if you could provide an overview of the profile of the Mexican immigrant community in the tri-state area in terms of size and demographics. In particular, if you could talk about the types of jobs that the community performs in the region and how their employment status has been impacted by the pandemic. Consul General, you might be on mute. I'm not hearing you.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
No problem.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're very clearly.
Oh, wonderful. Hi, Mike. Good to see you, and thanks for the invitation. Yes, I was saying, according to the American Community Survey, so the recent study say that more or less they think we are around 800,000 Mexicans in the tri-state area, which includes New Jersey, Connecticut, and New York. According to our own projections, we think we are more or less 1.2 million people in the area. But we'll see what the census tells us about, after the 2020 census proceed. We have the third largest minority community in New York. First one are the Dominicans, afterwards the Chinese, and then the Mexicans. Most of the people from Mexico who live in the area are not documented, 80%. Mainly, they come from a place called the Mixteca, which is in central Mexico and includes basically 3 states, Puebla, Oaxaca, and Guerrero. The people that come from these places are people with a very low education profile, and in some cases, unfortunately, they don't speak even Spanish. They speak local languages. So imagine the barriers that they found whenever they arrived to America. The people who work, the not documented people, Mexicans who work here, they work basically in 4 main areas: construction, in the restaurants, in food preparation. They also work in the cleaning services, and they also work in delivering groceries. We have another 20% of very high qualified Mexicans who work in the legal, banking, and financial services. And we do have also a very important group of people who are scholars teaching at Ivy League universities, such as Columbia, NYU, Yale, Cornell, and so on. So more or less that's the idea of the demographic Mexican community.
Thank you for that. I think we're having a little bit of trouble hearing you, Consul General. Maybe a little bit closer to the mic is what people are telling me. I don't know if that's helpful. No problem. Well, no, that was a helpful kind of overview and kind of a good level set of the Mexican immigrant community and the types of positions they have in New York. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the challenge that your constituents have really faced in their healthcare access, since the pandemic has started.
Yeah, sure, Mike. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, much better. Yeah.
Good. We have so many challenges out here, but I think that one of the most important challenges that we face during this pandemic is that most of our people, they didn't have access to the health system. And they didn't have access because they didn't have health insurance. And they didn't have health insurances because they can afford to pay health insurance. So that's a big problem because whenever the pandemic was in the highest part of the tour, they were not allowed to enter sometimes to the hospital. So that's why the consulate was very important with the health windows that we have to tell them, to orient them, to inform them where to go, with whom, and to have the full access to the medical service. But that's a big problem because they don't have the capacity, the economic capacity to afford this type of challenges. So in other words, part of the inequality that we're facing is because they don't have, I think, the appropriate wages, the appropriate, the sufficient funds to pay for this type of insurances so they can have medical assistance and also the family in general. So this is a great challenge. But let me add, and I don't want to write an opera, I don't want to sound in a very tragic manner, but the other aspect that is terrible is that we have persistent diseases. Why? Because we consume a lot of calories. And in that sense, we do have people with diabetes, we have people with a lot of problems of cholesterol, we have obesity, and so on. So it's a terrible mix, a fatal mix, that's the way I call it. That's why we have almost 30% of the total deaths of COVID-19 in New York were Hispanic. And on the top of that line was the Mexican. So imagine not having access to resources, financial resources, and having diseases, predetermined diseases. So it's a terrible mix, and that's why I think we have this terrible situation.
No, thank you for that. Maybe we could shift gears a little bit and talk about remittances. I think obviously a very important component here in the immigrant community. I know the World Bank has recently predicted a 20% decline in global remittances due to the pandemic. Can you describe maybe the possible economic and social implications of a decrease in remittances on immigrants' families in their home countries?
I'll do my best, Mike. I don't have a crystal ball, and I cannot predict the future. The only ones that I know that they predict the future are the economists, and they're always completely wrong. But I can tell you now that it's a very important source of foreign currency that we do have in Mexico. Let me just put you an example. Last year, we do have $36 billion just in remittances in Mexico, which is a very important source of money for us. But it's not the only one. And in Mexico, we have a diversified economy. In general terms, I can tell you that according to the Mexican GDP, remittances are more or less like 4%. So it's important, but we're going to handle it. And we think that with the new USMCA free trade agreement that will start next month, I think we can close the gap. Because by now, we have the most important free trade agreement worldwide between Canada and America. And with these new rules, I think we have the appropriate incentives so we can start to have more gains. But I want to be honest, it's going to be a very complicated year. For instance, the OCDE and the World Bank is projecting that America is going to decrease their GDP around 6.5 to 7%. Mexico 7.5 to 8.5. So I think that with the USMCA we can close the gap, and we're going to handle this challenge, which is a terrible challenge, but I think we can do it.
No, thank you. And I know we're very tight on time, but I would like just to maybe get in one more question, because there's a very important initiative that the consulate has been behind, and I wanted to ask you about that. That's the Ventanillas de Salud, the health windows. I know that's a collaboration between the government and private organizations, which, as I said, the consulate's been a key member. Could you maybe just describe the outcomes in this initiative and maybe discuss that a little bit for us? I think it's a very interesting initiative.
Thanks. Yes, in the last 3 months, we have been attending around 1,500 families, so we can orient them, inform them, and building bridges between the hospital network that we have in New York, with the Mexican families that they don't have access to the health system, and we've been supporting them also with mental health support with some psychologists. We've been helping with telemedicine also, and we've been supporting 24 hours, 7 days a week to a hotline that we have. So the people who have symptoms, they can call us at any time, and they will receive an answer. And we're going to help them, send them to the closest hospital, which are close by to their homes. So I think this is a very important program, that because the people don't have the full support of medical insurances, the Ventanilla de Salud has been a very important program to support them in this great necessity, and especially because the pandemic has been hitting us in a terrible time.
Well, Consul General, I'm sorry we had to rush through that a little bit, but I really...
We'll have the second part. Thank you so much.
Oh no, thank you so much, and really we're really honored to have you. So really thank you for putting up with a little bit of the lateness, and it was very interesting what you had to say. Thank you.
And thank you to Adrian also, and thanks a lot, Mike.
Thank you so much, Mike and Jorge Islas Lopez, the Consul General of Mexico in New York, for this very rich discussion. This session wraps up today's event. We'd like to thank all of the speakers from our earlier sessions for sharing their insights about the challenges of the immigrant population and the solutions that could pave a way to equity. Conversations like this hold even more importance today as we continue to see the growing magnitude of the effects of the pandemic. We remain committed to having similar conversations and raise awareness about the challenges communities continue to experience. On that note, we'd like to hear your ideas about related topics for future events in this series. So please take a moment to complete the survey that was actually just sent to your inboxes a few minutes ago. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and this concludes our event. Thank you again for all your time, and take care.